Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Emily Sumner, and I'll be your host today. I'm pleased to be with you on behalf of the SEL Exchange hosted by Castle. Before we get started with today's presentation, I'm going to go through just a few quicks to help the webinar run smoothly for you. We do have the chat open, and so feel free to share your greetings and any thoughts or ideas that come up for you throughout the webinar in the chat feature. You can also use chat to get my attention if you have any technical problems, and I'll do my best to resolve them for you. One thing you can do right now to make sure audio and video stays strong throughout the webinar is to close all the other applications on your computer. So Word, PowerPoint, any other internet browser tabs you have open, just close everything except for Zoom. I know that's really hard to do, but if you do it, all of your internet and computer bandwidth will go to power Zoom, and that can really keep your connection strong throughout the webinar. If you do have audio or video lags that last more than a second or two, you can log out of Zoom, come right back in, and that often resets the connection for you. We are leaving time for Q&A with our panelists, so please send in your questions as they come up for you throughout the presentation. We ask that you submit your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar rather than through chat. This just helps us keep them organized and make sure we don't miss any, so we've got them handy during the Q&A period. We are recording today's webinar, and we will email you a link to that recording along with your certificate of attendance tomorrow, so keep an eye on your inbox for those materials. As many of you know, each year Castle hosts the Social and Emotional Learning Exchange, which is a unique and timely forum for those who are committed to social and emotional learning. Last year, Castle had close to 2,500 people from around the globe join the virtual summit, and these ranged from researchers and practitioners to young people and community leaders. This year's virtual summit is coming up quickly on October 14th and will offer 4 hours of learning centered around how you can activate SEL to create conditions where young people can find their sense of purpose and channel their strengths towards achieving personal and collective goals. Registration is open, and we've got lots of folks already planning to attend, and we hope that you can join them. If you go to selexchange.castle.org, you'll be able to register as well as take a closer look at the program. We'll go ahead and put that link in the chat for you now. We'd like to acknowledge the generous support provided by organizations that are making a difference with SEL. Our more than 20 sponsors are dedicated to advancing SEL through innovative products and programs. And today we want to give an extra thank you to the Center for Responsive Schools. Center for Responsive Schools is the publisher of the Responsive Classroom, which is a student-centered social and emotional learning approach to teaching and discipline. We're going to share a great video about Center for Responsive Schools and Responsive Classroom here in just a moment, but I encourage you to go ahead and learn more about our presenter sponsor, Center for Responsive Schools, and their program Responsive Classroom at the link we're going to drop into chat now. All right, let's go ahead and get started with today's conversation. I am excited to welcome our panelists, starting with Earl Hunter II. There you are, Earl. Great to see you. Welcome. Earl has spent his entire career in the education field, first as an elementary school teacher in California, and now as a full-time education consultant. We also are pleased to have Dina Ross with us. And we'll let Dina come on. Dina spent 26 years with the Memphis Area Public Schools, where she achieved national board certification and was a recipient of the Rotary Award for Teacher Excellence. Now she presents courses and workshops for educators for the Center for Responsive Schools. Welcome, Dina. Great to see you. And we are also pleased to have Kristen Vincent here today. Kristen is Assistant Director of Marketing for Center for Responsive Schools and the author and co-author of several books, including Make Learning Meaningful: How to Leverage the Brain's Natural Learning Cycle in KA Classrooms. And hello, Kristen. It's good to have all of you here with us today. And I think Kristen is going to get us started.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you so much to Castle for this opportunity. At the Center for Responsive Schools, we strive to influence and inspire a world-class education for every student in every school every day through the responsive classroom approach, the Fly 5 social and emotional learning curriculum, and CRS publishing. And we have just a very short video to really bring to life those words and share what it is that we do at the Center for Responsive Schools.
Center for Responsive Schools is celebrating 40 years. Since 1981, CRS has been transforming schools into optimal learning environments for educators and students alike through academic, social, and emotional learning programs, products, and services. We offer a comprehensive SEL solution with our 3 brands: Responsive Classroom, Fly 5, and CRS Publishing. Let's take a quick look at each of these. Responsive Classroom is a student-centered approach to teaching and discipline. Our innovative program, which integrates academic and social emotional learning, is used by educators around the world. Fly 5 is a K-8 standards-based curriculum focused exclusively on teaching social, emotional, and behavioral skills. This helps set students up for success both in and out of school and beyond. CRS Publishing creates inspiring and relevant books that empower excellence in teaching and leadership. At Center for Responsive Schools, we're bringing hope and joy to educators and students in every school, every day. Visit us now at crslearn.org to discover how we can support your school and community.
And so I just want to share with everyone the goals of our webinar tonight. We want to make sure that we are helping educators understand the ways in which they know their students and the things that they believe about their students and how that might impact student learning and their own sense of belonging in our schools and classrooms. We want to recognize the importance of acknowledging cultural differences in communication that may exist between teachers and students in school. And we also hope that as participants, you'll walk away learning some culturally responsive strategies for communication in schools and classrooms, and to learn some practices for creating a welcoming, positive classroom environment that represents all of your students. So we're going to dig right into our conversation. And so I'm just going to be asking some questions, and we're going to listen to Dina and Earl speak from their own experiences. So we're going to dig right into topic number one, which is to think about what helps to create a foundation for equity and inclusion in classrooms and schools. And so the first question I have around that is, what is it and how might educators create that? So I'm going to have Dina answer that first.
Good afternoon, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here. The research that went into Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Dreiker's model of social science discipline supports the idea that belonging, significance, and fun are not just things that students want, but they're human needs. And we can think of belonging and significance as two sides of the same coin. Belonging being that feeling of being included and accepted and a valued member of a group, whereas significance is that sense that I am important and known for my strengths, talents, and attributes that strengthen the group. And fun is just that joy and fulfillment students experience when they can make personal connections to their work, have opportunities to collaborate, and bring their personal strengths into learning and have their academic needs met. Belonging, significance, and fun are the foundation for equity, because true equity starts with knowing our students and valuing all students, including students that are from historically marginalized groups. And what that looks and sounds like is our classroom walls having images that represent the many identities of our students, libraries and curriculum that include all of our students and their histories, and opportunities for rich and deep discussions, perspective taking, and time devoted to get to know each other.
Thank you, Dina. And Earl, is there anything you want to add to what Dina shared about belonging, significance, and fun?
No, I often, first of all, thank you for having me also. It's nice to be here with you as well, Dina. I often refer to that idea of creating belonging, significance, and fun. As in the workshop, I often refer to it as the Cheers effect. You know, like Cheers, the show, right? Where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came. And students want to feel like Norm. When they walk into the room, everyone yells their name and is glad that they're there. And they have their seat at the table. You know, Norm's was a bar, but they had their seat in the classroom, and that if they weren't there, someone would notice. And when we create that environment that lets them feel like they are in a place that is looking forward to having them there, then those needs are met. And when we meet those needs they're more available for the learning process. But see, it's the learning process is a dynamic process. And so we have to go back to, like you said, the work of Dreikers and Maslow and Adler, and meet those basic needs. And then we start to make students feel like they're seen, right? Like they're a part of something that is bigger than themselves, but also includes them.
And so I imagine a lot of that work has to do with knowing our students from the very start. We have to get to know them in order to figure out how to create that sense of belonging and significance for them. And so, Earl, what are some strategies for doing that work of knowing our students and for creating that sense of belonging, significance, and fun?
As education evolves and as the times change, there are a host of new ideas that come into place. But then there's also some of the old school, tried and true techniques of teachers, the old student survey. You may want to consider adding depth to it and really thinking about the things that make us us, and ask those things of students. I mean, just sitting down at a lunch table and having informal conversations give children an opportunity to feel like they're just humans. Children come into schools with this already sort of passed down hierarchy of sorts in the placement of importance in a school building. And I think it's our job as teachers to really flip that hierarchy on its side so that we all feel like we're just as equally as important. Every kindergarten child should feel that they hold as much importance as the school leader, the principal, or the head of school. When we're taking that time to get to know students in those informal conversations, it makes me think about something that you'll see in the book Yardsticks by Chip Wood. And it comes on page 13, and there's this simple table where it lists students' names and something that you know about the student. But I think there's one important part that is really sort of was eye-opening for me. And it's that idea of, does the student know that you know this about them? And so making sure to articulate to students that we know these things when we learn them and bring them back up in conversation. The look on a child's face when you bring up something that they mentioned in an informal conversation later on in class or in another informal conversation, it makes their day, it makes their week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, going through an exercise like that, if there's a column or a box about a student that you struggle to fill in information about them, that's information for you as the educator to spend more time with that student, to kind of walk with them down the hall and ask them a thoughtful question to kind of dig in a little bit about who they are and what they like. Dina, is there anything else you want to add to that those strategies that Earl had shared?
Yes, I just wanted to ditto what Earl said about leveraging the information that we learn about students and making that visible, as well as making the first unit about students and their families. I once taught in a school where the students spoke 42 different languages. And what an opportunity to learn about our students, have them learn about each other, and involve the families. Our parents and families are experts on so many things, and we can increase their sense of belonging by inviting them in to share. And the sense of pride on students' faces when they see their parents and siblings come in to share with the class a PowerPoint, some food from their culture, or just information about the geography of the places where their families originated. Those things are just priceless. Also, just making sure we're thinking about making sure that we are turning kind of that ableist culture on its head as well, and making sure that we have room for students in wheelchairs to get around the room, that we might suspend the use of a chime if we have students that are really disturbed by high-pitched sounds. So just making sure that we're utilizing what we know about our students to make the classroom environment places where they can all learn and thrive.
I'd love to add one point to that as well. When you think about sort of creating that environment, we talk about food. One of the things it reminds me of is something I used to do early in my teaching days when I just couldn't understand why I couldn't get high attendance at those back to school nights. I came up with this idea of having a potluck, right? You encourage folks to bring in a family favorite or a family recipe, and also making sure I worked at a Title I school at the time, and considering that not everyone can bring in this elaborate dish, just bringing in something, whether it be plates or cups, and just sitting down and breaking bread, right? Again, we have to go back to some of the things from our history that are tried and true techniques that allow us to feel seen. And I had the most successful times in those back to school nights just when we started with having informal conversations around what ended up being the dinner table.
And that is a great segue into our next topic, which is about communication, because communication plays an important role in creating a positive classroom community for our students. And you know, implicit bias can creep in all the time, and communication is one place where it sort of creeps in. And Dina, I'm glad you brought up the idea of just that ableism. And, you know, when we talk about equity and inclusion, we're talking about all of our students. So it's not just, you know, race and culture, it's all kinds of things that we want to recognize in our students and accept and make sure that they know that we see that. And so, Earl, I'm wondering, how might the ways in which we communicate with students either foster or inhibit the ability for everyone to feel like they're welcomed in the classroom?
You know, I came to a realization some years ago. Messages are as much about the receiver of the message as they are the person who is trying to relay a message. We often get so caught up in wanting others to make sure they hear our message, but do we create a palatable message or a palatable delivery of that message to make sure that the person is willing and able to digest what it is that you're trying to relay? That has to do with your tone. Checking one's tone is important because we don't always realize it. I have a thought partner in my wife and in my colleagues like you and Dina that I'll often call and relay a message and ask about how that sounds. You do have to be considerate of the styles in which different cultures communicate. I'll give you an example. I had a student named Jay. Jay was a student who benefited from some one-on-one conversations. And I was, in my effort to relay some important messages to Jay, Jay had a really difficult time looking at me while I was relaying these messages. And I continued to tell him, Jay, you know, just look right here. I want to know that you understand me. Just look here. And I kept doing it, and he just had the hardest time. He basically refused to look me in the eye. As I was sharing with colleagues in the lunchroom, as we do, a little bit of my frustration with what I felt like I wasn't getting through to him. One of my colleagues asked me, well, you know, are you talking about Jay Choi? And I said, well, yeah. She says, well, you know, Jay Choi is Korean. I said, well, yes, I know my kids. And he says, well, I don't know if you know, but it's a really important component of their culture is that children are not supposed to look directly into the eyes of their adults, especially in a situation like a teacher and a student. And so they might find it disrespectful. And boy, I felt, first of all, the first thing I did was I went and apologized to Jay. But it was about, I was so concerned with him receiving the message in the way that I thought was appropriate that I wasn't considering a whole history of culture that taught him, whether formally or informally, that you're not supposed to look directly into your teacher's eyes. And so, you know, we have to really think about making sure to deliver messages to people in ways that they are able to receive it. And we have to scaffold those things.
Dina, do you have something to add to what Earl was sharing, just about our styles and our tone and intention?
Sure. I think that it's important for us to know that cross-cultural communication can and will happen in a classroom. And it will sometimes lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations of students' responses and expressions. And for example, I was not a student who was used to being asked to do something that was expected of me. So if a teacher asked me, Dina, do you want to have a seat so we can start math? I might reply, no, thank you, I'd rather stand. And I've seen those types of exchanges end up with the student in the principal's office. So before we jump to conclusions, it's really important to approach these situations with curiosity and consider whether our communication was clear. Another point I'd like to make is it's really important for us to be aware of our implicit biases around students who question. This could be a strategy students are using for getting clarity or making sense of an assignment or task, or even an attempt to find purpose in what they're doing. If they're asking, why do we have to do this? Why are we doing this? And we also want to be aware of the different ways in which students express joy. Spirited expressions of joy, loud conversations may be a positive sign that students are engaged and enjoying their work. So it's really important for us to be curious and have compassion around dealing with cross-cultural communication.
I'd love to add to that also. You know, we have to consider how we teach children to communicate. We are models of it, but do we always give explicit instruction? Again, that scaffolding of teaching children how to get comfortable with sharing ideas. Dina talked about that, the sort of spirited communication. As a young biracial child, I grew up having different types of communication. There was a home communication. There was the way that I communicated at Little Mama's house and, you know, in Compton with my cousins. And then there was the way that I communicated in the classroom setting. And later, you know, someone gave a name to it and called it code switching, and certainly let me off the hook in feeling like I was communicating in two different ways. But there also, we have to consider teaching children mode switching, right? There are ways that someone is in a classroom setting, and there are ways that you are in an informal play setting. There's ways that you are in the playground and ways that you should be in a formal learning environment. You know, and going back to that scaffolding idea, we have to start with just getting children comfortable with sharing ideas. Turn and talk to a partner is a great strategy, because I've seen it with adults in adult learning environments where adults whose job it is to speak all day long in front of groups of children have a difficult time sharing in a whole group setting, but will be the most engaged and most, you know, valuable contributor to a partner conversation. One of the things I love to add to that when I ask children, okay, turn and talk to a partner, but then I add this little challenge, which is be ready to share something that you heard your partner say. And then that gives validation to those our timid little mice that don't necessarily feel ready to give an idea, but they might contribute something really valuable. And so a peer who shares their idea really sort of, you know, lifts up their classmate and lets them know that, oh, okay, what you said is important. And then another one is something that reminds me of ideas that come from the workshop, which is that idea of knowing when to just be silent, giving children think time. And that's a personal one for me, because my son Silas, who is a college freshman now, we found out when he was in the 8th grade that he has auditory processing disorder. He's a kid that when a teacher asks for hands up right after asking a question, that he would immediately check out, because he needed that extra 30 seconds to formulate his ideas. And that's how we create the conditions to give children the confidence to share in the group setting.
These are excellent strategies. And Dina, do you have other specific strategies that we can use in the classroom to make sure that all students' voices are welcomed and they're able to be heard?
Absolutely, Kristen. I had an administrator whom I worked under for 18 years, and her favorite line was, "Everything you do is teaching." And so our students' behavior will reflect what they're seeing from us. And so it's important to model inviting all voices. And so before I would ask my students to participate in a group discussion, I might say something like, if it's for the first time, we've had quite a few discussions in our classroom as a whole group. What are some ways that you've seen me invite people to contribute? And so that would give us an opportunity to chart some ideas, create an anchor chart to use as a reminder, and make it visible for students to remember how to invite some of those quiet voices in the classroom, how to share airtime, also coaching in the moment. Our students are gonna have missteps. And so mistake making is part of learning. And so being able to coach in the moment, practice some of the things that we've role played and put on that chart, and managing those tricky situations really helps them to build that competency of empathy, and then help other students build their competency of being assertive. So that coaching and role play is so important. And then another line that we used to hate in my old district as teachers is data doesn't lie. And so collecting data on who we call on in the classroom. What do we notice about those students whose voices are heard a lot? How does that compare to how often we call on others? And once we see the data, it's important to use it to make changes to improve what we're doing to make sure all voices are heard. One of the strategies that I would use was when students were working in group, and this was a group of third graders who really struggled with sharing the airtime, is giving them a talking stick. And so everybody had to pass around the stick and contribute something to the conversation before someone got to speak again. And so that was another strategy, kind of a concrete strategy for helping students develop that skill of being cooperative and allowing all voices to be heard. And then there's that ongoing work of implicit bias. That's not a one and done. These are regular discussions with our colleagues and times of reflection in PLC, where we're looking at what are some things that we've learned about ourselves. We all have biases. What have we discovered? And then how are we working to mitigate those things and making sure that our biases don't impact our students' ability to be heard?
Those are some, I was gonna say powerful suggestions there, Dina. And I was gonna say that, that idea of collecting data in the classroom is so important for an individual teacher in the classroom, but to take that data and almost taking a risk to share it with your colleagues, to show something you've noticed, like an aha moment that you've had about the ways in which you're communicating and interacting with your students, and then a change or a flip you want to make. That also builds bridges with colleagues and allows everyone around you to grow. So I think that's, just an amazing strategy right there. And Earl, what else did you want to add about strategies?
Well, again, I go back to some of these things are part of those old tried and true techniques that have lasted the test of time. Isn't that why we all had the can of popsicle sticks with students' names on it? To make sure that we didn't call on Trevor 4 times and Eden twice, right? Because we all have biases. Biases exist, and the beautiful thing about them is that we can do something about it. But first, we have to acknowledge that we have them. We have to take some time to analyze them. It doesn't make you a bad person because you have biases. It makes you a human being, because biases are just ideas, reactions to situations that are informed by our experiences. Now, we've all had maybe a challenging student or 10, and sometimes whether that student is a male or a female, or comes from a certain area, or is of a certain culture, it starts to create something in us that forms a bias. And when we analyze that, and then we start to actually do something about it, then it no longer is a bias. It's some information, and it allows us to grow. And going back to a point that you made, Dina, with regard to that coaching, That's part of our job, part of the many jobs that we have as classroom teachers. And one of those is coaching. And it really, there's so many informal times that you can use what we in Responsive Classroom call envisioning language. For those shy voices that don't necessarily feel like they deserve to be heard, that anyone wants to hear them, we can use that envisioning language and say things like, you know what, Dina, I've noticed that you've been doing some really deep thinking in the small group conversations. You may want to share that to the classmates because they really might benefit, or they would really benefit from your deep thinking. And as we continue to do that, those what we all call the attaboys or the attagirls to bolster students' self-esteem, that's when we create the conditions. We create an environment that lets them know that they can take risks. We have to foster emotional safety. In classrooms all over the country, we have done a phenomenal job of creating physical safety. With COVID, with all of the tragedies that have happened in schools throughout the years, we've really done a great job of figuring the physical part out. What are we doing to make sure that kids are emotionally safe to be contributors to their own education?
What role does all this have with communicating with families and parents and caregivers? I know, Dina, you talked about this earlier, inviting parents in to be a part, and Earl, you talked about that too, shifting up how you might do a back to school night just to make everyone feel welcomed. But what about when we're communicating with families and caregivers, and how might bias creep into that, and what can we do?
Well, it certainly does creep in, Kristen. And one of the ways that I have learned this is by making my own mistakes in communicating with parents. And like I said before, mistakes are how we learn. And one of the ways that we can be aware is to look at how we're framing our feedback to parents, and consider whether implicit bias is creeping in when it comes to behavior that annoys us. Sometimes behavior that is annoying in the moment is evidence of a strength that we're just not focusing on at that time. For example, would we describe a male student as bossy, or would we see it as a knack for leadership? One of the things that I've always, or I learned to try to make sure of, is that the first contact with a family after we've started school is solely positive, and that every contact involving something that the student needed to work on, that there was something positive said about that student during that conversation as well. And then I learned, instead of saying he's doing this or she's doing this or they're doing that, ask if the behavior, just say, I'm noticing this. Is this something that you've seen at home or in other social situations? And that kind of brings the barrier down from between the parent and student, the parent and the teacher, to say, I'm not blaming, I'm not, this is not deficit thinking. This is just something that I want to put on your radar and see if I might be missing something. And a lot of times parents open up, caregivers open up when we begin a conversation that way. One example is I had a student who would come in every morning crying. She would refuse to come to morning meeting. And after I talked with her and with the parent, I discovered that it was her older sister's responsibility to walk her to school every morning. And her sister was getting her to school too late for breakfast. And so the door to the cafeteria was closing as they walked in. And so she was hungry. And we know that students cannot do their best learning or participate when they're hungry. That was something that was easy for me to fix. So I made an arrangement with the cafeteria manager, talked to her about the situation, and she said, sure, just tell her to knock on the door if she comes in, and I've already closed the door. That really opened up the relationship between me and that student because she felt cared for. The parent felt that her child was safe with me, and we had a great bond. So I feel like that builds trust with parents when we begin conversations that way with curiosity and compassion.
Absolutely. And Earl, do you have something you want to share about parents and caregivers?
You know, so much comes to mind as a parent myself, and as a lifelong educator. Something I came to sort of a realization, you know, a decade or so ago, is that the relationship between home and we also have to remember, like, not every child has parents. Not every child is in a typical household situation, but the relationship between the home, the adults in children's lives, and the teacher is really one of co-parenting. I mean, let's be honest, children spend as much, or if not more, time in school buildings with the educators in their lives than they do awake at home throughout, you know, the week, Monday through Friday. And so we have this equal opportunity to impact the child, but it's important, like you know, I grew up in a divorced household. My parents, whether they enjoyed each other's company or not, they needed to be on the same page as to what was important and what was necessary to give me what I deserved. And I think it's important. Dina brought up a very important point about those biases and the things that may on the surface level irritate us. It's not about you. We all say, right, that we do this for the kids, and we strive to have child-centered classrooms, student-centered classrooms. Well, we have to live it. Our walk and our talk have to be congruent. And that sometimes requires us to check our egos at the door. And also, you know, there are children who I often refer to as Walters. I had a student named Walter once, a few years back, and he was a student that came to me with the story, with the preconceived notion, with the, oh, you have Walter next year, huh? Boy, good luck. That child deserves a clean slate every year. They don't deserve to walk around like Pigpen from the Peanuts with this cloud constantly covering everything that they do. Because what I found out about Walter was that this preconceived notion of the class clown and the difficult child came from something that happened in first grade. And now, as his fifth grade teacher, it was my job to abandon the ideas that have been hovering over them. You know, and it goes back to what Dina was saying about those initial contacts. I called Walter's parents in the first week of school to let them know what an honor it was to have him in my class. I gave him some responsibilities in the first week of school as being one of the examples in my interactive modeling lessons. And then I told them about what an impact he had. And that is how we start to change the narrative. See, as teachers of writing, we must also do a little bit of our own editing and rewrite and reshape the narrative that some children just cannot live down. And it's not by virtue of their own choices. They're children. We've all known that in recent research, we know that the human brain is fully developed at 25. So our elementary school age children, they're not even a third of the way through. And so we have to give them room to be who they are and to have not only a clean slate every year, but every single day. Every day, they should not carry with them the missteps, as you said very well, Dina, of the day before.
And I'm sure that also applies to our families and the caregivers that we work with, right? So I know some families can have a reputation that follows them through the school if there has been, you know, some anxiety or frustration in the past. And so as a teacher starting a new school year, it's so important to give those families a clean slate because their children are growing and evolving, and every teacher they encounter is a chance to develop a different and new relationship.
And it's funny you say that. As a fifth grade teacher, I became somewhat of an expert in 10 and 11-year-olds. But oftentimes families, they have a 10-year-old once or twice. And so handling that age, while we know what is expected of them, and by the way, a great resource to use in communicating with parents is yardsticks again. The work that Chip Wood put into yardsticks helps us to give children parents the opportunity to understand what is typical of students at this age, because oftentimes this is their first time with a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old or an 8-year-old for that matter. And so once we help to communicate that with them, then we can sort of let everyone off the hook.
Yeah, and often those tricky interactions with parents are a signal that there's a lack of trust. As a parent, I can remember sending my babies into middle school for the first time or into elementary school for the first time and not being quite sure that they were emotionally safe. And it really takes time for that trust to be built between a teacher and a parent. And we have to understand that when we're on the teacher end of it.
Parents bring trauma. They have traumatic experiences in their own lives as students. And so some of that it informs how they parent and that sort of perception of teachers and the roles that they have. So again, if this past year and a half hasn't taught us anything, I hope it has taught us all to just give everyone a bit more grace.
Yeah.
We extend more grace to one another and understand that we've all experienced trauma in some way, shape, or form, whether you have come from a family with endless means or families that are living paycheck to paycheck. Trauma does not have a socioeconomic or a gender or a racial divide. I mean, there are some things, let me not gloss over the fact that certain cultures experience traumas differently and maybe even more extensively, but the reality is we all experience trauma in some way. And so when we give parents, families, the adults in children's lives, the grace, then we just open up a space for everyone to grow.
Absolutely. So I would love for you guys to talk to us about some examples of unintentional microaggressions that we should all be aware of that happen regardless of our intention. As Earl said, we all have these biases. But particularly when we have maybe a cross-cultural interaction, like from your experiences as a parent and as a classroom teacher, what are some of those unintentional miscommunications or missteps that might happen?
Yeah, I'll go first. Deficit thinking is the first thing that comes to mind, especially when it comes to ways of being and communicating that are outside of the norms of the teacher or the majority in the classroom. And that can be around the assertiveness of girls, or even saying that some students are too quiet. How we deal with expressions of excitement and joy. That is oftentimes cultural. I was telling Earl yesterday that if you were to walk into my home while I was playing a game of spades, you would see a very different Dina than you see right now, especially if I wind up with the ace of spades and I'm able to slam it down on the table and grab that last book. And so if we have students playing games in the classroom, we're going to hear those types of expressions of joy from the students who are winning or students who are being successful. And so if we're trying to balance that with quiet learning, we can have certain areas of the room for the games and certain areas of the room for quiet learning. We can make space for all of the students in the classroom. Also, there's certain microaggressions around families, especially families that are being led by one adult or by an adult that's not the biological parent. In my own situation, I went to a conference and there was an assumption, even though every document the school had showed that my husband and I and the children lived under one roof and that we were married, it was assumed that I was a single parent. And so I did explain, while there is that I find the value of a single parent. A lot of my relatives are single parents. You have documentation that shows that that's not my experience as a parent. So really making sure that we are first recognizing that microaggressions occur and holding ourselves accountable when we're called on them. And even in my own case, I realized in my early days of teaching that I would create a story about why parents were disengaged or no shows at open house or conferences. And then I really began to think about it, especially in my own upbringing, where my mother went to school at night, and realizing that I was making some assumptions about whether or not people were working, attending school, or trying to hold down a job at the same time. Parents could, maybe I was making an assumption that everyone had transportation or childcare. And I really began to reflect and rewire my thinking around parent engagement, and then creating other opportunities, various opportunities for parents in different walks of life to participate.
That's great. And Earl, I'm wondering, going off of what Dina has shared, if you could share with us some actions that would decrease biases or microaggressions, or things that we can do if we're aware of them, or what can we do to be proactive about that?
First of all, we live in a phenomenal age of information. We have in little rectangles in every one of our pockets or purses, a key to being able to know just about anything. And so just spending the time to put as much emphasis or put as much effort and time into getting to know families, cultures, the different idiosyncrasies of areas that we teach in. Oftentimes teachers will come from other areas and teach students that they don't live around. And so what do you know about those areas, about the historical experiences? I just worked in Camden, New Jersey, where it's a very challenging neighborhood that all of the teachers don't live in. And so just taking a walk down to the local bodega and having a conversation with the people of the neighborhood just benefits teachers, the teachers there, for getting to know them and create and sort of removing some of those the preconceptions that we have. There's you can watch a YouTube video on how to do the latest hairstyle or the latest TikTok dance craze. You can also watch a video that is substantive about the experiences of families in a particular community. Again, I go back to my own example of Jay. If you don't think I then spent time understanding more about Korean families and customs and expectations, I did, because I found that I felt terrible about pushing someone to do something that just wasn't him. And me, someone who comes from a rich, very diverse background. My mother's Jewish, my father's Black. He comes from the Deep South and picked cotton, and she, grew up in a housing project in the Bronx. There are layers to things that impact who I am by virtue of my own parents' experiences. I had an experience where I was triggered by a picture of a cotton plant in a teacher's bathroom at a school I was delivering a workshop at. I didn't realize I had the trigger, but it was something that was passed down to me. And so really taking the time, we talk about implicit biases and that idea of analyzing them, but you can't do it alone. And so having someone, a trusted friend, colleague, parent, that you can have conversations around, because again, it informs who we are. We are dynamic and wonderful human beings that are also very flawed. And we have to take time to understand families and what they bring to the table, and also let them know that they're valued. Just having an informal conversation with a parent at the dismissal gate, not about how their child did today, but maybe about how work was, or anything that might be going on in their lives that's not academic in nature, lets them know that you actually want to see them. And you know what? You might find out, as I have in many occasions, that there's more that we have in common than what sets us apart. Again, that goes back to Dina's point about taking a step away from that deficit model. And rather than thinking about how we're different, there's so many ways that we are so the same.
And I think that takes us right into another question that I had, and it piggybacks on a question that came in from someone attending the webinar tonight. So as educators, we are the models for our students, and in some ways we can also be models for families and parents and caregivers. And so what are some strategies we can do to ensure that we're communicating and modeling for students that everyone is not just welcomed, but supported? And the question that came in from one of the attendees talking about belonging and significance and fun for staff, and how to strengthen that. So we can be the models in our schools.
I'll tell you, I love morning meeting. It is actually one of the most incredible gifts that was ever given to me in my teaching career. But one of the things that I loved most about morning meeting was spreading the joy. And I invited my administrators, I invited custodians, I invited lunchroom workers, I invited anyone that had a moment to spare to come in and experience the joy that is morning meeting. The look on kids' faces when they see an administrator, this person, again, in that unspoken hierarchy that's way up here, that's sitting down on the floor next to you, playing a fun game or sharing about something that they experienced, it really creates that space to give to and for each other. It's so important that we model, not just through words, but through actions, what we expect of children. We expect them to collaborate with one another. And so, again, go back to some of those old tried and true techniques of the book buddies between 6th grade and 1st grade, but it doesn't have to stop just there. Maybe you share lunch together. Maybe you go out and with another colleague switch and get to know each other's classes. Springtime every school year, I called my scouting season, where I go and hang out with 4th grade students just to get to know them. Before we were thrust into an academic setting, before they saw me as teacher, they just saw me as someone who was interested to know, what is that game that you're playing? Or I noticed that you wear red all the time. Those little things, like that must be your favorite color. Again, I think every parent, every person wants just to be seen. And if you take a moment to look in the mirror and think about what are some ways that you wish people could see you, I think it would allow us an opportunity to extend that to others. A question I often ask people, and I may have asked both of you, is what is something that you wish more people knew about you? It's a powerful question. If you just zip your mouth and listen to the answers, you will be amazed at what you find out that you can use then going forward.
And Dina, anything else to add to that?
Yes, I just like Earl said, that morning meeting or responsive advisory meeting, it's a godsend for children and adults as well. Beginning our staff meetings with something like that and taking time to connect, have some fun together, and form deeper bonds only strengthens our staff, and our students see that, and it supports what we do in our classroom. Modeling curiosity, following up on the great things that we're learning about our colleagues and our students by mentioning them in conversation, leveraging that knowledge and making it visible so that everybody knows about it. And then I like to use the power of observation. You can learn a lot by just watching. You can assess what are some things we're doing well here? What are some competencies that we've really developed? What are some that we can improve on and develop even more. And then I like to communicate that to the students. It shouldn't be a mystery what our learning targets are when it comes to social and emotional learning. And letting students know we're working on making sure that we include all voices. Here's some strategies that we have charted and thought about. And so when you're working in your small groups today, I'm going to be watching for that, and I'll tell you what I noticed. And making sure that we come back to that and reinforce the positive things and the growth that we see in students. I noticed that people made partnerships with others that were close to them and didn't always look for their best friend every time. And that shows that we're really thinking about how to be inclusive and work with everyone in our classroom. That's exactly what we've been working on and trying to strengthen in our classroom. And then the last part is be fair. Be fair and aware of implicit bias when we're responding to misbehavior and conflict. In the moment of conflict, we are there to mediate, not advocate. It's really important that students see both parties in a conflict or in a struggle know that we are there to mediate and help them find common ground. We're not there to take a side.
Really important point. And Earl, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and I just want to acknowledge a comment that came through that I think is helpful for me. It's something that I've been working on, and I just want to acknowledge that this person took a risk to share it with us. That
same page, Kristen.
that so this attendee has noticed that we've been using some gendered language, and one of the ways to make our classrooms more inclusive and is to switch to gender neutral language whenever possible. And so I just appreciate this person reaching out to share that with us, and it is something that I'm always aware of. But as I move through this space, especially with Earl and with Dina, I realize that I have habits that, you know, I have been using for a long time, and I appreciate that reminder to switch up something like that to make our classrooms more inclusive and make sure all voices are heard.
Absolutely.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
If you didn't say it, that was sort of the comment that I wanted to appreciate as well. At 47, there are some habits that are lifelong, and it doesn't mean that they don't deserve changing. And it's only when we have brave humans in our world that are willing to speak up for themselves, but also for a new, not new, but as a set of marginalized humans, people in our communities, that really their voice is just beginning to be heard after a very long time. It's not as though this is something that just happened in the past decade. There are those who are not cisgender, who are non-gender binary, or who identify by genders that do not coincide with their physical attributes that they were born with, that deserve that space. You know, in the same way that I work hard to recognize that they're not always parents. You know, that's a word that I stopped using in my classroom, parents, referring to people's parents. I also am working hard toward using more gender inclusive, or rather removing the gender exclusive commentary from the way that I work. I do it very well in classrooms. I don't do, you know, I stopped boys and girls a long time ago because also there are a lot of children during these times that are just coming to an understanding that there's a space for them to be able to express their true gender identity, but they may not have actually taken the step, the very brave step of actually articulating that. And so the more, as our participant pointed out, the more that we can remove the gender bias. Here we go. I think the three of us all recognize that there's a bias that we are continuing to work on. And again, this is what having grace is about. Just having grace and also doing the work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Earl. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I want to invite Emily back on here and thank Castle for this opportunity. And as we close out, I would love it if our attendees could just drop into the chat one idea from our conversation today that resonated with you or that challenged you. And we can kind of look at those comments coming in as Emily wraps up.
Thank you so much, Kristen. This was such a wonderful discussion, and I am so sorry that it's come to an end. I feel like I could go on listening to you all for a lot longer. So thank you so much, Dina, Earl, and Kristen, for being here today. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you who joined us on the webinar and all the comments that you're sharing. It's great to see that kind of thought that you're giving and all that you're doing to support your students. I want to thank the Center for Responsive Schools again for their sponsorship of today's webinar and remind you that the SEL Exchange is coming up on October 14th. Registration for the virtual summit is open. The link is there on the screen and we're dropping it into chat. It will also be in the email that you'll receive tomorrow that will include a link to the recording. I know I'm going to listen to this webinar again many times. There's so many great tidbits to pull from it. So be on the lookout in your inbox tomorrow for that email with that information and those links. Thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. And again, we hope to see you online October 14th at the SEL Exchange.